Well, hello, sisters. I'm so excited about the theme for this conference. Um, I'm really looking forward to learning the different perspectives that all the speakers are going to have on this what I'm calling the power of waiting. Um, we're probably going to hear the verse in Isaiah 40. I'm guessing we're going to hear it a couple of times during the conference. Um, those who wait for the Lord will gain new strength. So, let me tell a little bit about the Hebrew root for this word. Um, kavah, kavah. It means I wait, I look for, or I hope with eager expectation, which is really kind of cool. And it got me to thinking that this sort of understanding of like the positiveness of waiting really kind of goes against our culture, especially in the West. Um, in the West, we kind of see waiting as almost like a weakness, right? Um, where it has nothing of value in a world that says our value is in doing, 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 right? But to wait in the Hebraic sense of the word, I mean, it actually is quite active. So the thing about this kind of waiting is that it's tied in with hope. In hope that God is active in our lives, even if I'm not as active doing things for God as I'd hope to be or I'd like to be. So we have hope that, but hope not in the sense of, oh boy, I really wish it would happen. It's more like that expectation of hope. Hope that God has a plan for our lives. Even if, like in my case, looking for perfection, I can't see those little progresses. Now, in my life, I've had many, many times where I've been waiting for something. And I know I'm not the only one. You guys have things that you know, even now, even today, even this moment that you're waiting for. So, you know, I would encourage you as you go through listening to the speakers in this conference, be asking yourself if you haven't started already, what are you hoping for? What are you waiting for? And then also kind of take stock in your mind. How long do you think that you're willing to wait before you give up on God to answer? Like, do you have that thought that I'll wait just this amount of time and then I'm giving up? If so, and I have been there, um, I am there now when it comes to some of my adult children and the hope I have for their lives. I think what we need is new strength for the road ahead because the road ahead often looks scary, right? So throughout the conference, remember to wait for the Lord and then let Him give you that strength for the long haul. The thing I love about all of us doing this together is that we can wait together, right? Now, when I think about the part that God plays in waiting, my mind, I don't know, my mind goes to the book of Numbers. It's Bamidbar in Hebrew. So what I'd like to do is, in the time that we have together, I'd like to share with you how I view the wilderness as a type of waiting. Okay? And it's a type of waiting that's not unlike the waiting that we have, you know, after Shavuot and before the fall feasts. And it's not unlike the waiting that we do in any of those in between stages that we might find ourselves in, stages where we've come from versus where we're destined to be. right? Or between who we were and who we're becoming in God. So I'm going to focus on 4 things. The first one is talking about the purpose of the wait in the wilderness. The second thing I'll share is what a liminal space is. The third thing that I want to share is the kind of listening that I think that we need to do in the wait. And then the last thing, where do we go from here? So all 4 of these points, I want us to look at it within the framework of the Israelites' wilderness experience. Okay? So let's talk about the purpose of waiting in the wilderness. Now, I think to start sort of unveiling this, we can actually just look at the name for the book of Numbers, which is Bamidbar. And the reason I say that is because it's in this book of Numbers, or Bamidbar, that we get a peek at the Israelites' wilderness experience. So Bamidbar means in the wilderness. And I think that we can glean some insight by looking at the root letters of Bamidbar and then comparing them to other words that share the same root. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to take a lot of time talking about this. But here's something that, and I'm not a Hebrew language expert, and I'm still working on naming the Aleph Beit letters. So this isn't going to be very deep what I'm going to share. But what I have learned so far is that Hebrew has far less words than English does. So what that means is that each Hebrew word can have a variety of meanings. What I find almost comforting, but certainly exciting, is that when we're looking at Hebrew words, Hebrew letters, Hebrew roots, we can prayerfully ask the Father what meaning of that word that He wants to highlight for us in any given Hebrew word. Okay? So, the root of midbar is davar. And this davar as a root has a variety of meanings. But it's also the word for speak or word. But it literally means to order or to arrange words. Now, Jeff Benner is a Hebrew word scholar, and he says that the word midbar is a place existing in a perfectly arranged order. Wow. He says it's an ecosystem of harmony and balance. And he further says that by placing Israel in this environment, God is teaching them balance, order, and harmony. Okay? Isn't that great? The wilderness is, and rightly so, often seen as a place of anxiety and chaos. Now remember, I'm equating the Israelites' wilderness wandering with the waiting that you and I go through, okay? It's often a place of anxiety and chaos. But with God, He brings order and structure and balance in the wilderness. He's above it all because He created it all. The same root can mean oracle, the place of speaking, inner sanctuary, or a dry, uninhabited land, or a pasture where sheep go to feed, or words spoken from the heart or the inner place of God. Isn't that amazing? This is wait. Okay? This is the wilderness. Can you see how the wilderness comes directly from God's Word? His Word is heard in the wilderness. So because of that, you and I don't need to be afraid when He invites us with Him into the wilderness. So, okay, how is waiting like the wilderness? Well, you know, all that wonderful revelation that was received by the Israelites at Mount Sinai, that's going to be put to the test in the wilderness. Because it's in the wilderness where the Israelites experienced what it meant to live as citizens of a real kingdom. Those words of Torah are going to be lived out in real time with one another and anyone that they encounter along the way. So remember that waiting is an opportunity to put into real-time practice what God's been teaching you, maybe through scripture, before that wait. Okay? So waiting has an active purpose. Now, if you're like me, you've read about the wilderness wandering so many times that, well, at least I did this. I didn't stop to ask the question all those times I read it before. Is there a redeeming point to the wilderness? You know? I mean, sure, the wilderness is that place that's after Egypt and before going into the land flowing with milk and honey. And, you know, when you look at the whole of Numbers and the wandering, there's a lot of waiting that goes on before they get into the land of promise. But at one point I started to get curious about the wilderness as its own intentional destination. And that's when I learned some really amazing things that I didn't know before. So, you know, we know that the whole story of God's deliverance of the Israelites, that's like completely entwined and tied up with this wilderness, this midbar, this waiting. The Hebrews were delivered from slavery in Egypt to something. And what was it? It wasn't the promised land, because that was a future promise, right? Hence the name, Promised Land. Well, the deliverance from slavery was for the purpose of going into the wilderness. But why? Well, that brings me to the second point, or the second thing that I want to share today. And that is that waiting is a type of liminal space. Liminal space. Have you ever heard of liminal space? It comes from the Latin, which means a threshold. Okay? So think of a liminal space as a transitional space. It's where we leave something behind that feels comfortable and safe while we're not really knowing what lies ahead. It's a space where we feel as if we're on the threshold between what is behind us and what is in front. Now, when you stand on in an entryway to a building, you're not outside and you're not inside. That's the threshold, and that's liminal space. Now, liminal space was originally studied as a middle part of a rite of passage. So the idea is that societies have developed rituals to mark the movement from one stage to the next. So like childhood, maybe to adolescence, adolescence to adulthood. Another example would be the movement of singlehood, to married. Now, these stages, these rites of passage, they all have 3 stages in common. The first one is a separation or a break from the past. Okay, and then the third stage, I've skipped the middle one. The third stage is re-entering society with a new identity. Okay, well, the middle stage is a stage of transition. That's the liminal space. That's where you're no longer who you were, but you're not quite yet what you will be. It's the stage, whether it's positionally or whether it's more internal, it's the stage between the old and the new. And when you think about it, that's the wilderness experience, right? And I bet that you can think of times in your life that fits this description of the liminal space. Maybe you're in a liminal space right now. I mean, I think in a broad sense, we all are. This time after Shavuot and before the fall holy days is also this space. So let me let you in on something, which you may or may not know. When we exist in liminal space, it can feel as if that next thing is never going to happen. But remember that delay doesn't mean denial, right? We know from the examples in the book of Bamidbar, Numbers, that it's often in the delay that God teaches us how to live in his hope. Now, myself, having been in these in-between places a time or two in my life, and I just recently came out of one big one very recently. Because of that, I'm really fascinated by the idea that the Hebrews get delivered directly to this threshold by God on purpose. Now, I don't know about you, but I used to judge the Israelites in their wilderness wandering. I mean, I'd ask questions like, why did it take them so long to trust God? I can't believe now that I asked this question, but in my younger days, I did. Why did it take them so long to trust God? And why did they grumble and complain so much? Well, now I know from experience, we tend to do that. They had a lot to learn about living in liminal space. They had a lot to learn about God's breeding ground for their new identity. And they had to learn to trust that he was right there with them in that uncomfortable in-between space, right? So liminal space, which is a kind of waiting, it changes us really like no other space that we can be in. So when God brings the Hebrews into the wilderness, he's bringing them into liminal space to practice what they learned intellectually. And he did it in order to reshape and reform them so that they could accurately reflect his character in the world. It's like a breeding ground for the new identity, like I said. So, what do we do in the waiting? We put into practice the principles of kingdom living that before were only theoretical. Isn't that cool? And would you know it, God is right there with the Israelites. He's fine-tuning their walk while they wait to enter the promised land. And he is right there with us, fine-tuning our walk as we wait, and he waits with us to enter into whatever that next is. Who is like our God? Now, one final thing that I want to say about liminal space is that it's to fully utilize the liminal space. We need to assume a posture of submission to God because he's in there, right? So we need to learn to listen to his voice. So I want to share with you a time that he refined my walk while in the literal wilderness. Now, this is an example of living in liminal space, the waiting. But it also will speak to my third point that I want to share, which is the kind of listening that we need to do in the wait. Okay? So, some of you already know this. Some of you were in this with me, literally. I actually got to spend time in the same wilderness that the Israelites did. My husband and I got to go to Israel for Sukkot back in 2019. That was my second time there, but it was the first time I spent in the literal wilderness, in the desert. So there I was at Biblical Tamar Park, and that is one of the 42 wilderness campsites from Torah. This is the area where Abraham walked, where he raised Isaac and Esau. The history there is so set apart. So they'd been telling us all week that being in the wilderness, the Israel wilderness, away from the distractions of modern conveniences, that's going to practically guarantee a special encounter with God. Whoa. Big claim, right? Okay, so confession time. I live in Montana. I thrive on cooler temperatures. And what I experienced in the literal desert wasn't very spiritual at first. It was in the upper echelons of the 90s. It was sticky. The sand was dusty. There were flies everywhere. And this time of year, the area is dry and parched. During the days leading up to Sukkot, it's particularly dry because the land hasn't entered into the wet season yet, and that comes after the days of Sukkot. When we left, God, as he does every year in his faithfulness, he sent those life-giving rains. And it's actually a tradition during the times of Sukkot to pray for rain during this time. In no way am I dissing the land. In no way am I giving a bad report to the land. I hadn't prepared myself to be in the desert. That doesn't mean that there was anything wrong with it being hot and dusty. Okay. So, but for me, when I was thinking about what my special encounter with God is going to be like in the wilderness, I was hot and I was bugged by flies and I was complaining. And I was doing this while I was sitting in a tent replica of the kind of tent that Abraham and his family lived in. The walls and the roof were made by local Bedouins, so they were authentic, if not ancient. And so here I am in the desert. So I would sneak off from the teaching group and sneak off from my husband to spend alone time. And so I wanted to take advantage of that alone time and see if, okay, God, what do you have for me, right? So in this desert quiet, I began to wonder if I was able to quiet my mind long enough to hear God in the wilderness. And I began to really, really question if I could be attuned and attentive enough to be able to process what God might say to me. It was really, really, those were some things that were really on my mind a lot. You know what they say about the desert? The heat alone can bring out the worst in a person. And my husband and I were wonderful examples of the heat bringing out the worst in us. Now, little background story. My husband, we've been married 28 years. He has been kind of frustrated with me for our whole married life because a lot of times I ask him to repeat to me what he's just said to me. Okay, so he'll say something and, huh? What? And throughout the years, he's been kind and gracious to just repeat, repeat what he said. But this issue really, I say for some reason, I know now, but at the time, for some reason, it really came to a head in Israel. We got in fights about it. And he and I were wondering if maybe I was losing my hearing. And so we talked about, well, when we go back to Montana, I need to get my hearing checked. Because it seemed like everything that he would say, my husband would say, I would huh? What? Can you repeat that? And bless his heart, he got super frustrated because he thought I wasn't paying attention to what he was saying. And nobody wants to think that when they speak, the other person isn't listening to them. So he ended up just saying, oh, never mind. And then that would be the end of that. And again, he's usually not frustrated with me, but that desert heat, Jump forward to today. we now know that I have what's called central auditory processing disorder. So what that means is that my hearing is actually good, but I process verbal sounds slowly and I miss words often. So it's kind of like before my mind can wake up to listen, over half the words of what someone has said is already gone. At the time in the wilderness, what I did know, though, I didn't know that was the reason, right? But I did know that whenever there was any kind of background noise around me, and this is also part of central auditory processing disorder because it's really bad for me. Okay, so if there's any kind of background noise around me, when it comes to processing language, I can't. I'm a goner. So there I was in the desert of the Arava, wondering if, just like the problem I'm having with my husband, Randy, maybe I'm not hearing all that God is saying to me because of another kind of background noise, right? Because the desert's quiet. So I'm wondering, I'm thinking, okay, am I not hearing God? Because remember, we were told you're going to have an encounter with God, right? Am I not hearing God because I'm not listening well enough? Because is there background noise? No. Well, then maybe I'm not on the listen for him. I'm not listening specifically for his voice. Okay? So because the desert is quiet, it caused me to realize that there's still a lot of, well, he did talk to me. I did have an encounter, and this is what he told me. Okay, this is what I learned. There's still a lot of self in me. That's this droning background noise. And just like audible background noise, that makes it more difficult for me to hear. So the droning background noise of my needs and my wants and my desires and my insecurities, they're loud in my life, and it makes it difficult for me to hear God. So maybe it does take heat and sand and flies and sweat and tears for me to be reminded of what his voice sounds like. Because his voice sounds different in the waiting. His voice sounds different in the waiting. It was a painful lesson, but it was also good to be in the desert wilderness so that I could learn some important truths about how to listen to God in the waiting. So point number 3, while we wait, we need to listen for the sound of thin silence. The sound of thin silence. Kol damama daka, and I'm not pronouncing that right. Kol damama daka is a Hebrew phrase that we've translated still small voice. Remember that? It's from 1 Kings 19, 9 through 14. But literally, it's the sound of thin silence. So this still small voice was given to Elijah after he complains to God, and I'm not going to blame him for complaining. But he complains to God that all of God's prophets have been killed by Jezebel, and he's the only one surviving. And I wonder if you've ever been there thinking that you're the lone survivor or the lone, something, the only one that's keeping Torah. And you're not sure how much longer you can hold on alone. How much longer can you wait before you're not the only one, right? Well, one of the things that's so great about this conference and so great about the Rooted Cafe is that we have a solid tribe of people to share our burdens with while we're in the wait, right? When we have a tribe, we can very much believe that we're not the only ones facing an insurmountable task or life or something that no one else has to deal with. So for Elijah, God sent that mighty wind. Remember the wind, the earthquake, the fire? And he did it to teach Elijah that God's voice was not in any of them. So after all those really big expressions of nature, God spoke to Elijah in the sound of thin silence. Kol damama daka. Now, I don't know about you, but I would tend, well, and Elijah did this too, expected to hear God within those, within the earthquake and the fire and the wind, the big things, right? We tend to think that that's where we're going to hear God. If I was expecting to only hear God in those big things, I would be a little disappointed when he didn't come through. If I was expecting to hear him in the feast days, that time between Shavuot and the fall feasts, I might not even expect that he would be speaking in those little times, in that wait, right? I'm imagining, so in my mind, I'm thinking about Elijah and his time alone, right? After he's expecting God to show up in the wind and the earthquake and the fire. And if I were him, I would be getting a little antsy right now. I'd be wondering, okay, if he's not there, where is he going to be? What's going on, right? So I'm a super introvert, which means I do need to spend considerable amounts of time alone to recharge. But, interesting, I also orchestrate activities to record over that sound of thin silence, the wait. So I overlay these sounds of busyness because I don't like, or didn't like, the sound of thin silence. Busyness can look, for me, could look like taking care of my family, dealing with the cares of the world, writing, and even doing good deeds done in God's name. Thin silence used to make me nervous for some reason. And I wonder if I'm not alone in that. Because thin silence is where I can hear the condemning thoughts in my own head. Those thoughts of unworthiness, or of missing out on what others have or what others do. Fears, fears in general, but I had a lot of fears for my now adult children. Thin silence, that waiting, is a wilderness where I can feel most alone. So I used to think that I wanted that voice at Sinai instead, the giving of the 10 words, the 10 commandments at Sinai. That was such a unique moment in the religious history of mankind. Instead of one lone witness to the voice of a God who then tells everybody else what he heard, what we have there is an entire nation witnessing, experiencing the voice. And that power and that majesty of God at Sinai was unmistakable. No matter what the people were doing, when that voice sounded, it was so significant to all of their senses that they stopped in their tracks and they just experienced it. And it didn't matter what distractions that they had come up with to cover that thin silence nobody thinks they want. His voice was so loud and so clear, and it came through so loud and clear, right? At Sinai, he broke through their distractions and he broke through their competing idols and the defense mechanisms that they put in place while they continued to think of themselves as slaves in Egypt. It was like through no effort on their part. They heard his words loud and clear. They didn't have to lay down the distractions, right? So mighty was his voice. And that's what I used to think that I wanted. I wanted all of those distractions to kind of keep me company until God, boom, speaks. And then I wanted the sheer magnitude of his voice to overpower those other things in my life that I hold dear, so that I get the best of both worlds. I get my way until God speaks, and then I can easily hear him. When I thought like that, it made sense that I hated liminal space. It made sense that I hated the waiting. It was uncomfortable, and I dismissed it as being useless, waiting for those big moments. Now, we're told in that account on Mount Sinai that there was thundering and lightning, and it says the people were afraid and they trembled and they stood a long way away. And they said to Moses, "You go and speak to God, because if we continue to hear his voice, we're going to die." His voice was that powerful. And at the sound of that voice, they were so terrified of closeness, being close to him, that they begged for a stand-in instead of direct experience. Well, in time, I realized I don't want that. And I bet you don't either. I'd rather have his nearness, even if it's in that liminal space of uncertainty, even if it means in that waiting. But I think that means that we have to brave the sound of thin silence. So Elijah, in his time of need, his time of feeling so alone, he gets a voice that he could hear only if he's truly tuned in, right? He has to venture into that thin silence where his aloneness might be deafening around him. And that's where God was for him. Now, laying down the distractions to hear the sounds of thin silence, that takes a lot of effort on our part. A lot. And, we've kind of been conditioned to believe that too much active efforts to draw close to God, that's like earning your salvation or keeping it, or dead works. And heaven forbid you and I substitute works for grace. So sometimes we feel justified to keep our distractions intact, and we think that it's more spiritual to wait for God to shout when he wants our attention. So we might think it's more spiritual to wait for the wind and the earthquake and the fire. But often what we get is kol damama daka. We get liminal space. We get the wilderness. We get those days between Shavuot and the fall holy days. We get those days where our adult children are stumbling along on the path and they're not walking in the destiny that you know is there for them. We get those times when our husbands have not taken hold of the beauty of the Torah. Insert any weight that you're in. We get that weight. So, where do we go from here? What actions? I'm a gal that likes practical solutions. I like to put things into the practical. So, what actions do we need to do to draw close to God when he's not in the wind, in the earthquake, or the fire? Well, I really believe that we have to lay down our distractions. You might need to identify what they are first, right? But lay down the distractions and get quiet enough and still enough to hear God in kol damama daka. Laying down our distractions is not a passive action. Do you know what I have found to be a powerful weapon against distractions, at least in my life? Gratitude. Gratitude to God for the things that he's done for me, for my loved ones, for you all. What's something that I have realized is that gratitude is a powerful force that drowns out the angst of my day, and it allows me the courage to enter that thin silence. And I got to tell you, being reminded that Elijah has been there too. I know he lived a long, long time ago, but for some reason that helps me to know he's kind of traveled this path too. So maybe you would like to try the practice of gratitude as a way to enter kol damama daka, to hear God. I suggest start by recounting his great deeds. You can start with those in your own life, and then the lives of your loved ones and the lives of those around you. A great thing is to recount his deeds from the pages of Scripture. Say them silently or say them out loud, but say them to him, right? And I guarantee that before you know it, you're going to be so filled with wonder and awe at what he's done and who he is that you do stop thinking about your worries. Then be silent and just be in that thin silence, knowing he's there. And you'll hear him. And he has a lot that he wants to say. The last thing I want to say also comes from this question of where do we go from here? This is a way of an encouragement, okay? Remember that you're of a chosen generation. Think about what you're waiting for, that hard wait you're in, okay? While you wait, it's normal to feel that in-between space that consists of where you once were and where you're going in him. We can get inspiration from God's creation. You know, it's no wonder that the caterpillar builds that chrysalis to hide away from the world during its transformation. It's losing its caterpillar identity. I wonder if the caterpillar realizes in this stage what's happening. You know, that stage of, like, when it's in its chrysalis, so there's this stage of decomposition and reconstruction. I wonder if it knows what's going on. I wonder if in that stage it's forgotten that it was born with a potential to become a butterfly. And the hermit crab also buries itself in the sand when it molts, right? I'm going to guess that these creatures don't get hung up on the in-between. And they probably already understand that deconstruction is just part of pressing on to the newness as they hear the voice of their Creator calling to them to transform. I think they trust and obey. Now, is that instinct or is it more than instinct? I don't know. But what I know is that you and I aren't always going to be in that threshold. We're not always going to be in that in-between stage that we find ourselves in. But while we're there, we can use it as an opportunity to put into practice what we've just intellectually learned. So it's not only okay that you find yourself in an in-between stage at this moment in time, it's also ordained for your good. It makes me think of the Hebrew word Shema. You know, hear, as in hear, O Israel. Listen for when it's time to arise. Shema means listen and make adjustments to your life to the words that you hear. Listen and allow yourself the proving ground, the trials, the testing to become what he calls you to become. Or if your wait has to do with loved ones, to become what he calls them to become. And we can be confident that when it is time, God will call you or that person that you're thinking of to arise in an act of love and devotion and faith in the one who gives us his newness. We can arise. This is our identity. We're the one who moves forward toward our God. We may not have recognized it before, but there's a lot of activity in the wait. We need to remember that we are a Hebrew, which means one who crosses over. But before you cross over, remember you're standing on the threshold, right? So don't despise the threshold. It's part of the process. And your threshold experience is going to look different from anybody else's. And this threshold experience you're in now will look different from one you were in before. Now, one of my liminal spaces has to do with recovering from what I call spiritual orphanhood, the feeling of not quite belonging to God's family. Do you ever feel like this? I've kind of been standing on the threshold of what I once was, what I will be. So if this is, without me going into great detail of spiritual orphanhood, if this kind of calls to you wondering, do I really belong? Or what does it mean to belong to God's family? Remember that here we are, orphans no more. We're fully accepted. We have full responsibility and full rights as heirs to the King, our Father. We've received adoption out of the life of sin and into the life of spiritual covenant keeping. And it's through no merit of our own. It's not up to us to perform or to uphold. God has made us a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, because we're adopted. So I wonder if you know that you belong, if you trust that you belong to Him, or if you might still be feeling that in-between space, that liminal space that consists of where you once were, spiritual orphan, and where you're going, son or daughter, son or daughter in Him. Learning that your Heavenly Father accepts you fully as His own can still take some time to walk out in belief, like the Israelites at each campsite of the wilderness wandering. Sometimes that feeling of belonging is the reason I bring that up is because sometimes that is the liminal space that we find ourselves in. So if that's one of your spaces, I want you to take heart that God delights in you during your transformation, during the stage that you might be feeling you're in, from feeling and acting like an orphan to acting like a son or daughter. Philippians 1:6, He who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. He will be faithful to take you from your threshold into the newness. He sets the lonely in families. He leads the prisoners out with singing. Psalm 68. So, my sisters, listen for His love song in that wait, in that quiet, in that wilderness. And welcome home. Y'all have a great rest of the conference, and I'm going to have to watch it all on replay, and I cannot wait. See you later. Bye.